across America. Live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. On our Thursday, we're going to be covering a lot of different topics. This first hour is kind of an open line, so if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. I'm going to cover a lot of different stories fairly quickly, and those range from, we'll focus a little bit of time in this first segment just because it's in the news about the impeachment issue, the inquiry, and the whistleblowers, and whistleblowers in plural, because I'm going to talk about how we, at least at ABC and CBS, have treated one whistleblower or two there compared to how they're saying we should treat the whistleblower on the Ukraine call. So we'll get to that in just a minute. And then we're going to get into a very important meeting that took place just the other day. Kelly Shackelford was there. He will not be with us tomorrow, but I suspect we'll still hear about it some from Jeremy Dice as well as Keisha Russell. But I did want to talk about that because it has been a remarkable number of judicial nominees that have been confirmed, and want to talk about that. I want to get a little bit into polling. David Kupelian's been on the program before. This would be one of those ones in the past I would have said, well, see if we can get him on. But, I think I can kind of summarize his material and save us having to give him a call on this, on polling, and why we should even be more skeptical about polls than we have been in the past. And I'll get into that in just a few minutes. Victor Davis Hanson, almost everybody's quoting his piece today on history has shown that socialism isn't the cure, but he has 4 good reasons. And this is going to turn into a commentary that I'm sure I will write on 4 reasons why he thinks socialism has become somewhat successful in America. And then we'll get into some other issues. Elizabeth Warren, the whole question of the Medicare for all, and how Kevin Williamson says Elizabeth Warren thinks voters are stupid, and we'll explain some of that as well. And that won't even necessarily cover the entire first hour, but we'll see where it takes us and how long it takes me to get some of that on the table. But next hour, we'll have with us Robert Hutchinson. It's been a while since we've had him on the program. His book, The Dawn of Christianity, is a book that if you've ever gone to Israel, and we've had now 3 trips to Israel, one just to Israel, one to Israel and Greece last time, just recently, came back from the one from Israel and Rome, and we may do one more a year or two from now, probably 2 years from now. But still, those are some great opportunities. As you go through the book, he's got some great pictures of some of these archaeological sites, some of the geographical sites, and the rest. So if you've ever been to Israel, you will love the book. But even more so if you haven't been to Israel and say, look, I just don't think I'm ever going to get over there, but I'd like to know a little bit more about the Holy Land. Again, you can see his narrative, which really just follows the Gospels all the way up to the book of Acts, and then the pictures and diagrams, which just, and again, bring some of that back to some sense of reality, because it is one thing to read that in the Bible. It's another to be there, but next best is to see what that looked like. What does Caesarea look like? What does Capernaum look like? What did Jerusalem look like at the time? What kind of tombs do we have? It's just amazing to see some of these. And there are some places in this particular book that I've not been to. I've never been to what is considered to be the traditional tomb of Lazarus and a few other things. So it has been helpful for those of us that have been to Israel, but it's helpful whether you have been there or not. So we're going to spend some time talking about his book, The Dawn of Christianity, how God used simple fishermen, soldiers, and prostitutes to transform the world. Just a great book. And then we will get back to the issue of apologetics, something we like to do from time to time, although this is more of a little bit of a narrative of a story. It's by Mary Jo Sharp, one of the leading apologists, teaches at Houston Baptist University, and it is always encouraging to me to see women that work in this area of apologetics and evidence. And hers is Why I Still Believe, a former atheist reckoning with the bad reputation Christians give a good God. So she's actually going to help us understand that sometimes the worst advertisement for the gospel are some of us Christians walking around and how we act. So she'll take that on. And it's important in that regard for not only apologetics, but also we have noticed, and I think we're going to see more of these, individuals with high profile who maybe had a relatively shallow Christian faith that one day just simply announced that I'm not sure I'm a Christian anymore, and I'm walking away from the faith. And so that's why we do some of those kinds of discussions, because we really want to help you deal with, I think, the doubt that you might have, some questions you might have, and even some of the ways in which Christians sometimes are the worst advertisement for the gospel. But just real quickly, and I won't spend a lot of time because all the other major networks probably will, or at least some of the conservatives will talk about these 2 points. Maybe some others won't. And the first is that we now know that the attorney to the whistleblower, this is the whistleblower that blew the whistle, if you will, on the Ukraine call. His name is Mark Zaid. We then find that back, interestingly enough, January 31st, 2017. So Donald Trump had been in office a few days. He puts out this tweet that someone found. The coup has started. Many of the first steps of a rebellion and impeachment will fall immediately. And so we find out now that not only did he post those tweets back 2 years ago plus, but now he is the lawyer representing this whistleblower. And so as a result, as this came out, then, of course, last night, Mark Zaid sent Fox News a formal statement about that, because his argument was he just believed that Trump would be stepping over the line. But let me just read his statement. Mark Zaid said, "Those tweets were reflective and repeated the sentiments of millions of people. I was referring to a completely lawful process of what President Trump would likely face as a result of stepping over the line, and that particularly whatever would happen would come about as a result of lawyers. The coup comment referred to those working inside the administration who were already just a week in the office standing up to him to enforce recognized rules of law." Well, you know, we've talked about the fact that we've had this coup going on, and it's interesting to find out that the whistleblower's lawyer actually used the words coup and impeachment, and that did not escape the notice, as you might gather, of Donald Trump, who informed a Louisiana crowd the other day that the whistleblower's lawyer used those words, and so that was kind of interesting. And to put that in context, we keep hearing that we don't want to expose the whistleblower. This individual has been an individual that has had high integrity and does not need to be actually removed from office or anything like that. But then you got these articles coming out now because, as many people have been talking about, Project Veritas has this video which shows that one of the ABC News employees was just furious because the major news story that she had 3 years ago about Jeffrey Epstein was squashed because it implicated not only former President Bill Clinton, and that would be bad for Hillary Clinton, but also the British royal family and all the rest. And so there are people at ABC News that felt like they knew who the former employee was. That particular tweet came out just the other day. And now I've seen this tweet, which simply says, "Two sources familiar with the matter tell me that CBS News has fired the staffer in question. This comes after ABC informed CBS that they had determined who accessed the footage, expressing her frustrations about the Epstein story." So you see kind of an interesting thing. We need to protect the whistleblower, and it really isn't a big deal about the fact that the whistleblower's attorney called for a coup. But on the other hand, ABC and CBS, we are going to make sure that that whistleblower there gets a pink slip. Anyway, let's come back. We got a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A significant percentage of Americans have little or no retirement savings. That means that future debates about Social Security may become even more contentious than they have been in the past. As I've discussed in previous commentaries, the only thing in the Social Security Trust Fund are IOUs. Sometime in the future, government may not have the necessary funds for all the baby boomers who are currently retiring. A report from Northwestern Mutual found that 1 in 5 Americans have no retirement savings at all. The survey also found that 2/3 of people with a savings account or retirement plan are certain that their money will run out sooner than they hoped it would. That means they would be totally dependent on Social Security. Even when implemented, Social Security wasn't intended to fund people's retirement for such long times. It was originally intended to provide income supplement for men for about 13 years and for women for about 15 years. That was the life expectancy for 65-year-olds in 1935. Of course, Americans now live more than a decade longer. When you look at the baby boomers who were polled, you find that 1 in 3 have $25,000 or less in their retirement savings right now. Many of them already are thinking of extending their retirement dates. In fact, Northwestern Mutual estimates that nearly 1 in 4 will retire at age 70 or older. Because of medical advances, people between the ages of 65 and 70 are often fortunately able to work longer. But the bigger issue is not whether they are able, but rather whether they are willing to work. Given the option, most Americans would like to kick back and retire at 65. The latest surveys about retirement savings make that less likely, so we'll probably observe a graying of the workforce. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And once again, next week, of course, we're going to see some of the live broadcasts for the very first time of this whole idea of impeachment. And I thought I would just add one more comment, and we're going to move on because, again, we are going to be impeachment out very quickly, but we do want to, every once in a while, acknowledge a few things that are being said in the media that might be worthwhile. And this comment I made just a few minutes ago about the whistleblowers is significant. But there was one other one that I've sort of saved until now. We might get into some of this on Friday, since we will have two lawyers in the round table and talk about the process of impeachment and what is or is not constitutional and all of the rest. But there is a point that I thought I would make just apart from the issue of impeachment per se, and how there have been a number of individuals that have said the comments that are being made don't make sense. And I am, for just a minute, going to quote from Britt Hume. Now, I had the privilege when I was vice president of the student body. This goes back to 1974. That's a long time ago, 45 years, I think, is what that ends up being. And I met Britt Hume. He had been at that time working for Jack Anderson, and they needed somebody to introduce him, and I introduced him. So actually, I've known Britt Hume for 45 years. Only a few people I've known longer, one of them, my wife. So it's kind of interesting that every once in a while I see some quote from Britt Hume. And he was talking about the fact that there has been a lot made of the testimony by Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vidman. And he is an individual, of course, who was one of those individuals listening to the phone call with the Ukrainian president. And he, at one point, at least expressed, and this goes from the Washington Post. So first of all, recognize that this is secondhand, but it's probably accurate. Said that he apparently was deeply troubled by what he interpreted as an attempt by the president to subvert U.S. foreign policy. Now, Britt Hume, with a great deal of wisdom and experience, I mean, after all, he was working for Jack Anderson 45 years ago. So here's a man that almost for a half a century has been covering politics in one way or another. So I tend to trust him rather than some 20-something that maybe hasn't even read the Constitution that gets put on one of these morning talk shows. But nevertheless, he said, the trouble with the statement is it's illogical. Why would it be illogical? Because it's the president who determines U.S. foreign policy. His actual quote on Twitter was, it's the fact that the president is the constitutional author of foreign policy, so the idea that he's subverting foreign policy is by definition illogical. I don't know if anybody else brought that up, but I thought it was pretty insightful, and it's just something to remember when words get thrown around so often and words get to be redefined in ways that are probably not even accurate nor appropriate. So that's all we're going to talk about with impeachment. We'll probably get into it again tomorrow, and so that's all that I think we'll cover, because I like to cover some stories that nobody else is covering. That has been really kind of the modus operandi. It has been kind of the mission of Point of View, really since Marlon Maddox started it back in 1972. That goes back even farther now, doesn't it? Because we're now talking about 47 years, almost 48 years. So here we're talking about something that was a desire at his point. It's something we still do to this very day, although now I think because of the proliferation of information, sometimes what we need to do is tell you which sources of news might be true and which ones are not. But one of the stories that just didn't get much coverage, and so I waited a day just to see if it did, and I was right, it didn't. It had to do with this very special meeting, and Kelly Shackelford was there, and in that meeting, I can see just from the picture there that you have the Senate Majority Leader. You have one of the Senate Majority Whips. You have, of course, Senator John Cornyn and others. Of course, you have President Donald Trump, and you have Vice President Mike Pence. And, of course, you have all sorts of other people. But nevertheless, the article here that I'm just going to read from real quickly from Patriot Post said, while Democrats were busy with their impeachment charade, President Donald Trump and the Republican-controlled Senate have been busy reshaping the federal judiciary, and that has not escaped our notice, says Patriot Post. We've reported on it numerous times, but the left media would rather sell advertising by getting eyeballs for wall-to-wall impeachment drama. We had an event the other night in which Kelly Shackelford even said to the audience that you probably wouldn't know about all the individuals that have been confirmed to the court that are people that we would enjoy if you weren't either listening to Point of View or subscribing to some of the material being put out on a regular basis by First Liberty. According to the White House report, now I'm going back to the material from Patriot Post, as of this afternoon, President Donald J. Trump has appointed and gotten confirmed 158 life-tenured federal judges who will defend our constitutional personal liberties and the rule of law. That includes 2 Supreme Court justices, 44 Circuit Court judges, and 112 District Court judges. The White House also says his historic pace is also accelerating. The president is set to have more judges confirmed this year alone than in all of 2017 and 2018 combined. Matter of fact, one picture shows the president shaking the hands of Mitch McConnell, and a lot of that has to do with Mitch McConnell. 3 more are expected this weekend and dozens more in the wings this year. The White House had some other highlights. President Trump's nominees alone fill 1/4 of the seats of our nation's Circuit Court of Appeals. He has seen more Circuit Court judges confirmed by this point in his presidency than any past president in U.S. history, which is one of the reasons why they had that meeting. Trump promised as a candidate to nominate solid conservative judges, and he's followed through. But a lot of credit goes to, and here is the comment by Patriot Post, to the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. He's come a long way from the days when we criticized him and then House Speaker John Boehner for weak leadership. On the judiciary, McConnell made the most gutsy move of his career by refusing to hold confirmation hearings on Merrick Garland, Barack Obama's nominee to fill the venerable Antonin Scalia's seat. He decided with good reason that to allow Obama in the last year of his presidency to totally swing the Supreme Court with a leftist in the seat as a constitutionalist was unacceptable. McConnell held firm. Trump beat all odds and won, and we now have Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court. Patriot Post goes on to say that McConnell's stewardship is even more laudable given Democratic resistance. According to the Daily Signal, Democrats forced cloture votes on 118 of the president's judicial nominees, a delaying tactic to extend debate. For the previous 5 presidents combined, the Senate held only 7 cloture votes. So you could see how they were really trying to slow down the process. And I think that's important to recognize that they were even slowing it down for Obama nominees. So it wasn't just they were slowing down those that were put forward by Donald Trump, but some of them in the pipeline actually had been proposed by Barack Obama. They had cloture votes and 30-hour debates on those too because he just wanted to slow everything down. But finally, they said, as Trump put it in a speech yesterday, when judges write policy instead of applying the law, they impose sweeping changes on millions of Americans without the benefit of legislative debate, public rulemaking, or the consent of the governed. As a result, these highly political rulings inflict painful damage on our security, society, and economy, imposing unworkable edicts on businesses, workers, families, and law enforcement. He goes on to say, I will do everything in my power to halt judicial activism and to ensure the law is upheld equally, fairly, and without political prejudice for all of our citizens. On the subject of judicial nominees, they say, interestingly enough, Trump most definitely earned an A grade. Well, if nothing else, that was a meeting that took place just the other day. It was not covered well by the press, and probably is a good illustration of how some of the most significant things that sometimes happen aren't necessarily lead stories, aren't necessarily in the headlines. And one of the reasons why we are dedicated to cover some of those kinds of stories on a regular basis. We come back, one of the things I want to do real quickly is just help you understand that when you see a poll, we've always had to have a little bit of skepticism. How many people were interviewed? What kind of attempt to try to have that mimic the general population in terms of percentages, and a variety of other things. But now there is even more reason to have skepticism about the polls. And David Kupelian's been on the program with us before. I love it. It says, hey, Sean, meaning Sean Hannity. Hey, Sean Hannity, here's the real reason polls are wrong. And so we'll talk about some of those polls. And of course, you've heard us say so many times, it's an axiom right here at Point of View that really the only poll that really matters is the one that takes place on Election Day a year from now. But some polls give you some trends, and they're worth reading, but you have to keep a few things in mind. So when we come back from the break, I want to again give you a little bit of discernment so that you have a little better understanding of the significance of certain polls and how to read certain polls and how to maybe recalibrate them in your mind in light of some things that we're going to put on the table. We'll do that right after these important messages.
When you give to Point of View, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. One of the articles we've posted today is called Texas is a Battleground, and that's from the individual at the Democratic National Committee thinking that Texas could be a battleground. Now, the argument that you would make very quickly is if Texas is in play and Donald Trump can't win Texas, well, then the election is over. But there are a couple of reasons why individuals believe that. One is because Beto O'Rourke did so well against Ted Cruz. I think that's a one-off. Don't know that's going to happen again. But the other has to do with polling. And that's where we're going to focus on that. You can read the article. It's from The Hill, but I want to look at this in a broader way. So whether you live in the state of Texas or not, and I know we have listeners outside the state of Texas even this hour, and we're going to have a whole lot more as a couple of these stations go online in Chicago, in Seattle and Spokane, Portland, a number of other places. So this is really for you no matter where you live in the country. And David Capellian wrote, hey, Sean, here's the real reason polls are wrong. And he points out the fact that oftentimes Sean Hannity on the program will say, what's up with the Fox poll? You're oversampling Democrats by 8 points. And even yesterday, if you were listening to the program, I talked about a couple of these polls that were very definitely oversampling some of those individuals. And so, first of all, a lot of people have said journalism is wrong, but there is a sense in which in some cases polling is wrong because we're starting to see how out of touch these polls have been with reality. Let's just take one simple example. On Election Day, you had the election of Hillary Clinton, right? I mean, that's exactly what was predicted by the New York Times. They gave Hillary Clinton an 85% probability of winning. And, of course, you know the rest of the results. So there are all sorts of questions that you obviously have to ask. And he talks about this. You know, we can talk about sampling, wording of questions, the order of the questions, whether it's going to poll likely voters or registered voters or just adults, voting status, whether you're going to call just people that have landlines or cell phones online, on and on and on. There's a lot of that. But let me try to, just for a minute, digress from this piece by David Capellian to a column I wrote a number of years ago, and I think it's maybe about time to do it again. And that is to say, you have to look at polling in a couple of different ways. I'm not going to get it too esoteric here, but it is important to recognize that when people say, well, these polls are inaccurate because they didn't talk to me. Well, you can look at the statistics to say that a typical 3-day poll of 1,000 people, if proportioned somewhat accurately among the 3,000 counties in America, will accurately represent where Americans are, what Americans believe, 19 out of 20 times. In other words, it will have what is called a 95% confidence within 3 percentage points. So most of these polls, if they say that it's a margin of error 3%, then you can say that they've probably actually interviewed at least 1,000 people that are at least proportioned in some kind of representation of the various counties in America. And then they, of course, have to begin to rate those in terms of age and party affiliation and a number. And that's where a lot of these polls, especially almost all these impeachment polls, have oversampled Democrats. And that's understandable. You can read the poll, and sometimes they'll even tell you what the percentage was, and you can see that as well. So the question oftentimes isn't whether or not the polls are statistically accurate, because if you've been in the polling business any length of time, I don't care if you're Rasmussen or whether you're Gallup or whether you're ABC, Washington Post, whether you're CNN, whether you're Fox News, most of them probably have the statistical accuracy down. The real question is who is being interviewed. And as I just alluded to a minute ago, a poll of Americans in general don't tell you anything about the next election. A poll even of likely voters, there's the problem. Over the years here at Point of View, we have tended to many times trust Rasmussen because he's been able to figure out some ways to really hone down on the people that actually vote. If you ask somebody, did you vote in the last election? They'll go, yeah. If you ask somebody if they went to church Sunday, they'll say yes lots of times. If they didn't go, they just think they did. And so you have to ask a little more penetrating kinds of questions to really begin to get down to the likely voters, because typically about 57 to 60% of Americans that are registered vote actually vote. And that is maybe even going to be high next time, because I suspect there are going to be so many negative ads, a lot of people just aren't even going to go, but we'll see. But even in my column I wrote years ago, there is what's called kind of the social desirability bias. We could see this in a lot of the polls that were done in the past on the state marriage protection amendments. They always passed with a higher percentage than predicted in the polls, because if you say, well, I'm going to vote for marriage protection, it looks like I'm maybe anti-LGBTQ, so I probably won't necessarily always say yes. And so the percentage were always higher, never an exception. But the biggest issue is this idea of social desirability, which has oftentimes been referred to as the Bradley effect. Many years ago, when Los Angeles Mayor Tom Bradley, an African-American, was running for the mayor's race, he lost in 1982 despite being ahead in all the polls. And some voters told pollsters that they were undecided, even though they were probably going to vote for his opponent. It's sometimes been called the Wilder effect. You have the same thing happening with Doug Wilder, who was a governor in Virginia. Most of the time it's called the Bradley effect, sometimes the Wilder effect, but that is certainly the case. And a lot of people back in 2016, if they were asked who you're going to vote for, they wouldn't really feel comfortable saying, well, I'm not going to vote for Hillary Clinton because she would be the first woman as president. So there was that. And then the other is already there was a fair amount of criticism of Donald Trump, so you didn't necessarily want to say that. So it was almost like a twofer. I don't want to say I'm not voting for the first woman to serve in the Oval Office, and I don't want to say I'm going to vote for this New York Playboy, but I think I am going to vote for him. And so that's why the polls were very wrong. Well, more recently, there have been some studies coming out that actually verify this with some precision. And I go back now to the piece by David Capellian. The British Psychological Society's Research Digest reported that a major factor, which was well documented now by the University of Arkansas researchers in the Journal of Experimental and Behavioral Economics, found that people with unpopular opinions feel the need to conceal their true voting intentions, which again is called the socially desirable responding effect. So that may be the new name rather than the Bradley effect. And you might say, well, why would people feel that way? Well, David Capellian has preceded this with all sorts of great examples. If you're watching the media, you see an elderly Trump supporter sitting in a restaurant being spit on because he was wearing a MAGA hat. You see some people stealing the MAGA hat, the Make America Great hat, off of a young person. You have others that have said some really nasty things about them. You have some saying, go back to Russia, blah, 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 I can't even say some of the words. Or you have that 15-year-old boy who was one of the Covington Catholic kids who basically saw his life turned upside down. By the way, his father's now bringing a lawsuit. I just, matter of fact, got an appeal letter from the father about that because he's not a public figure. So as a result of this libel suit against the Washington Post and a variety of other news organizations is going forward. I mean, if you're a public figure, Donald Trump, Sean Hannity, whatever, you really have no recourse. People can lie about you. People can say all sorts of awful things, and there is no recourse. But he's not a public figure. He was just a 15-year-old kid who got kind of a funny look on his face when this man approached him beating a drum. And then for days, even when we knew the real story, the press continued to reemphasize that. And so as a result, there have been so many people now seeing stories about people that maybe supported Donald Trump who've been fired, who've been boycotted, who've been doxxed, who've been shamed, insulted. And so when somebody comes knocking at your door asking for your opinion, or when you get a phone call from a pollster asking who you're going to vote for next November, how do you think you're going to answer? And so this is one of the reasons why I think when we see these polls, for example, that say right now that a generic Democrat actually will outpoll Donald Trump, even in, for example, the state of Texas or other places, you got to take it with more than just a grain of salt, maybe a whole bag of salt, because there are some very good reasons that have been well documented by social researchers as to why people sometimes, back to the actual comment from this article in the Journal of Experimental and Behavioral Economics, feel the need to conceal their true voting intentions. So if you thought polls were a little bit inaccurate in the past, might even be more inaccurate in the future because of some of the research being done by some of the people that have gone back and looked at the polls and tried to explain why they were so wildly inaccurate. Anyway, let's take a break. We've got a lot more to cover, and we will do that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention at the top of the hour, we're going to have Robert Hutchinson with us. And again, this has been the first time in a long time since we've had him on, although you might not feel that. I just looked it up, and even though we interviewed him back in 2015, we repeated it in 2017, and we played the same interview on Labor Day. So actually, you've had a chance to hear him more recently if you happen to be listening to Point of View on Labor Day, but it's been a while since we've had him in on the program, and this is just going to be a great book, The Dawn of Christianity, How God Used Simple Fishermen, Soldiers, and Prostitutes to Transform the World. But, okay, I did kind of dip into the issue of impeachment. Let me dip into one other, the political campaign, and that is Elizabeth Warren. Kevin Williamson says that he course, the title of his article, I assume he wrote the headline, Elizabeth Warren thinks voters are stupid. And we can go into why he says that, but the opening sentence, I think, gets us into the discussion. He says, the bad news is Elizabeth Warren has some barmy ideas about raising your taxes. The good news is she's a proven coward. The first thing you might say, barmy. Well, if you're British, you'll know what barmy means. It's kind of foolish. That's a nice translation. So anyway, new word for today, barmy, B-A-R-M-Y. And so these have barmy ideas, but she's a coward. And it's really simple, and I'll just go through it real quickly, because the point is Elizabeth Warren really has staked her future as a presidential candidate on Medicare for All, which is commendable in terms of its courage, because this health care scheme, as Kevin Williamson points out, will cost $2 trillion every year forever. Now, he says the problem with that is when we hear billion, trillion, quadrillion, we don't even know what that means. But let's put that in perspective. Last year, in our fiscal year, all federal tax revenue from all sources amounted to $3.4 trillion. So she's talking about basically 2/3 just for health care for this. And if you want to look at it another way, I always love to try to get out of those numbers, because the numbers are hard to get even when you see them on a screen, really hard to understand when you're listening on radio. So he says, put another way, if the federal government continued collecting taxes at the current rate, stopped spending even a nickel on anything else, and put all of that money into Medicare, it would have to do so for 12 years just in order to cover the difference between what Medicare has already promised to pay out and what dedicated Medicare taxes will actually fund, which is why a lot of people think the future of Medicare is not good. We'll leave that for another day. But if you think that is the case, it isn't just that Elizabeth Warren wants to spend all of our money on health care, because Elizabeth Warren and the other Democratic candidates want to spend trillions of dollars, he says, on subsidies for college students, student loan forgiveness, alternative energy subsidies, and a variety of other things, in addition to spending $2 trillion a year for expanding Medicare. And to pay for that, she would have to raise federal tax revenue by about 80%, and that still would do nothing about, as he says, the trillion-dollar deficits we already have, or the unfunded liabilities of Social Security and other entitlement programs that are already piling up even faster than the official national debt. And so the argument always is, well, we'll just raise tax rates. Yes, but tax rates and tax revenue aren't the same. If I raise your tax rate and you are a millionaire or a billionaire, are you just going to pay that? Or are you going to say, I'm going to probably invest it somewhere else, or I'll just figure out ways to shield it so that you won't get as much? And so tax revenues and tax rates are really two very different things. But back to his second point, she has some barmy ideas, but she's a coward. And I thought, okay, where does that come from? Well, in about the fourth to the last paragraph, he reminds us of something I'd forgotten about, and that is, in order to pay for the Affordable Care Act, oftentimes called Obamacare, there was a so-called Cadillac tax on expensive health care plans, and there was a very relatively small tax on medical devices. Well, the medical device tax was suspended, and he says, does anybody remember who led the charge to repeal it? Well, that'd be none other than Senator Elizabeth Warren. And he says, in theory, Senator Warren represents Massachusetts, but in reality, she represents Boston and its wealthy suburbs, which are home to a number of medical device companies. And so Kevin Williamson goes on to simply say this: a politician who cannot stand up to a relatively minor special interest demand back home while serving as an elected Democrat in one of the most reliably Democratic states in the country is not going to oversee the doubling of the federal tax burden in pursuit of a new welfare program that also would strip most Americans of the private insurance they already have, mostly want to keep. It's not going to happen. So just kind of an interesting update on Elizabeth Warren. Still, there are a lot of people that are convinced that she will be the nominee for the Democrat Party. And if indeed she is, we'll be talking about her a lot between now and this time next year, because she will then be the opponent to Donald Trump. One last piece, Victor Davis Hanson, anywhere you go right now, he's trying to answer the question, in light of the fact that when we look at all these socialist countries, former socialist countries like Russia, but still pretty socialist, certainly socialist and Marxist like China, and then you got Cuba, Nicaragua, North Korea, Venezuela, all sorts of failed states. And then you even have the soft socialist European Union countries that are stagnant and mostly depend on U.S. military for protection. Why is anybody enamored with socialism, the socialism of Bernie Sanders, of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or even of Elizabeth Warren? And he has 4 points. The first is we have a lot more people in this country who are foreign-born. As a matter of fact, the estimates are the number of foreign-born U.S. residents and their children around 60 million. And so that's a lot of individuals, and they have come from countries where the state controlled their economy, and so they bring some of those same ideas with them. Number two, he says there has also been kind of this new socialist craze in Silicon Valley. His argument is maybe it's due to the fact that some of the new progressive rich feel guilty about their unprecedented wealth. And so they sort of buy into this idea of redistribution. And so as a result, that is the case. Number three, and I think this may be one of the most significant, universities bear much of the blame. And it's in a variety of different ways. First of all, the way it's taught in the schools, but he's not even talking about that. He's talking about the fact that because of the way in which these universities have been able to manipulate the federal government to guarantee student loans, we now have 45 million borrowers struggling with nearly $1.6 trillion in collective student debt. And so as a result, a lot of them are postponing marriage. They're single, childless. They're feeling cheated by their high-priced degrees that don't give them competitive salaries, and maybe they think socialism is the answer. And the fourth and final one, he doesn't simply remove Republicans from some of the blame, because he says some of the doctrinaire Republicans for decades mouthed orthodoxies of free rather than fair trade. They embrace the idea of creative destruction of industries. And so as a result, a lot of people are feeling really, in a sense, betrayed by the free market, which was really brought about by some of the policies by Republicans. And so he says you add up a lost generation of woke and broke college graduates, waves of impoverished immigrants without much knowledge of American economic traditions, wealthy advocates of boutique socialism, and asleep-at-the-wheel Republicans, and you end up with the socialism that we have in front of us today. And if indeed Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren are actually nominated, you will have a very definite socialist running on the Democratic Party in terms of their ideas. And that's not name-calling. That's essentially what they're doing. And actually, in the case of Bernie Sanders, exactly what he says he is doing. So we will see how this plays out. And Victor Davis Hanson has done, as he always does, a great job of helping us understand why there is such an interest in socialism when we look around the world and see so many failed experiments with socialism in other countries. When we come back, we're going to spend some time looking at the story of Christianity, the dawn of Christianity, with Robert Hutchinson. All that coming up right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
If you listen to Point of View any length of time, you know that we oftentimes like to go back to the gospel, go back, of course, to the book of Acts in the New Testament. We've even had a number of tours of Israel. We've gone to Israel, in Greece, Israel in Rome. And so one of the books I thought we might want to focus on this hour would be very helpful. If you've ever gone to Israel, ever gone to the Holy Land, as you read through this book, you will love it, because there are so many pictures of places where you have been, and it really helps you understand a little bit more of what actually you were able to take in. But even for those of you, and I would say that would be the majority of you listening right now, that probably will never be able to make it to Israel, this really gives you an opportunity to see and feel what is in the gospel. Now, of course, it's really important to read the four gospels. It's important to learn about the life of Jesus, and then even to follow the book of Acts and go to Caesarea and go to Philippi and go to Corinth and really get a sense of what that was like. But this is a book that I think you're going to really enjoy, because it pulls together the geography, it pulls together a lot of the archaeology that we've talked about here on Point of View. And it is written by Robert Hutchinson. You might be familiar with his name because he's been with us before as we've talked about his book, Searching for Jesus. And even more recently, we have replayed that interview on a number of occasions. So you might say, yes, I do remember him, because just recently I've had a chance to hear the replay of that excellent interview. Individual that studied philosophy as an undergraduate, moved to Israel to learn Hebrew, came back and received a graduate degree in theology from Fuller Theological Seminary, has really developed a tremendous skill at writing and taking us into the story of Jesus in the New Testament. So, Robert, welcome back to Point of View.
Hi, Kerby. Thanks for having me on again.
One of the things I love about this book is you have so many pictures. I know that makes the book a little more expensive, but it is just so wonderful, because if you've ever traveled to the Holy Land, ever had a chance to go on a tour, you've seen some of this. But even if you have not, it is just wonderful that you not only give us, if you will, the narrative, but you actually show us what it looks like in some of these places that are described in the Bible.
Yeah, I thought that was very important, and you're right. I really had to push to get the pictures in, because it's a pain for publishers to include a lot of pictures, but it really brings the story alive, I think, when you can actually see the actual places. And so many of the sites of the Gospels and Acts still exist, and in a startling way, pretty much as they existed in the time of Jesus. And a lot of people don't realize that, and I thought it was very important to have that.
Well, I think that is the case. You know, if you're in the Galilee, you have Capernaum. If you're on the coast, you have Caesarea Maritima. If you, of course, go over to Greece, you know, basically Corinth looks like Corinth did then. Philippi, ruined, but still looks like it does then. And so there is a sense in which when you talk about walking where Jesus walked or walk where Paul walked, you can understand that in ways that really make the Bible come alive, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I try to do with this. I've told people, anybody who has an opportunity to go to Israel should absolutely do it. It is expensive. It's a difficult trip for many people, especially if you're older, but it's really well worth it, because the Bible really does come alive when you're there. I think for many people, they hear the gospel stories in church, and they hear them over and over again, and they just kind of lose the sense that this is real, that this actually happened. And that's what I was trying to do in this book, is to kind of bring it alive, tell it in a fresh way, fill in some of the details that the gospel writers didn't feel they didn't really need to say, because they presupposed everybody already knew all this stuff. But we don't know that stuff, and so I tried to fill in the details from archaeology and just traveling, just what it looks like today, so that it would be a little easier for people to see in one coherent way.
The book is published by Thomas Nelson. It is hardback. We have information about Robert on the website, as well as about this book, The Dawn of Christianity. And the subtitle, for a minute, I might just mention how God used simple fishermen, soldiers, and prostitutes to transform the world. That reminded me a little bit of the conversation we've had with Dr. Rodney Stark on one of his books, The Twilight of Christianity, trying to explain why this, if you will, Jesus cult eventually dominated the Roman Empire and took over Western culture. In a sense, that really is the story of the gospel and the story of the book of Acts, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, I've been criticized because I wasn't implying Mary Magdalene was a prostitute. But, you know, Jesus says that tax collectors and prostitutes are entering the kingdom of heaven before you, the Pharisees. So to me, that is a sign that there were prostitutes among his followers, or reformed prostitutes. And, what Rodney Stark says is, and he's read my book, and I think he's absolutely wonderful, is one of the big reasons for the success of Christianity was its inclusive character, that it was open, not merely to an elite, but to everybody. God is calling all people into his kingdom, not just, the elite of the elite or something. And that was the story behind the subtitle.
Well, certainly, it's a great subtitle, by the way, because I certainly agree with that. And I might just mention, before we get into the book per se, that you say, I write as a Christian, but not only for Christians, but for people without any religious ties or interested in learning who Jesus of Nazareth actually was. This is the kind of book that if you had just an open-minded individual might say, okay, I'll give you a chance to convince me that what I've been hearing about the Bible, maybe even read when I was in Sunday school, I'll take a chance and read through this, because you really are just kind of taking them through the various aspects of the New Testament and giving them geographical insight, historical insight, and archaeological discoveries that really validate and actually confirm all the things that you find in the New Testament.
Yeah, I mean, I really do feel my mission, if I can describe it so grandly, is to reach out to everybody, not just believing Christians, but the whole world, and retell the gospel story and the good news in an accessible way that everybody can understand and can at least follow. And I feel like a lot of you have scholars writing scholarly books, and then you have kind of apologetic books written for believers, and not too many people write for just ordinary people that maybe went to church when they were young but have fallen away from the faith in some way. And those people, I think, deserve to be reached out to as well. And that's what I try to do in this book, is basically retell the story of the Gospels and fill in the details that may make it come alive more for modern secular people.
Let's take a break, but again, some of the sources obviously are the New Testament, the works of Josephus, the Talmud, as well as various historians and the Dead Sea Scrolls, early Christian writers and things of that nature, as well as all sorts of archaeological discoveries that have come down, and then just the evidence for the historical reliability of the New Testament. When we come back, we're going to start out and begin in the gospel stories and work our way to the book of Acts, and just share a little bit of the road to Jerusalem, alive, beginning of persecution, and the expansion of the Jesus movement. All that coming up right after these important messages. Our conversation today with Robert Hutchinson, The Dawn of Christianity. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A significant percentage of Americans have little or no retirement savings. That means that future debates about Social Security may become even more contentious than they have been in the past. As I've discussed in previous commentaries, the only thing in the Social Security Trust Fund are IOUs. Sometime in the future, government may not have the necessary funds for all the baby boomers who are currently retiring. A report from Northwestern Mutual found that 1 in 5 Americans have no retirement savings at all. The survey also found that 2/3 of people with a savings account or retirement plan are certain that their money will run out sooner than they hoped it would. That means they would be totally dependent on Social Security. Even when implemented, Social Security wasn't intended to fund people's retirement for such long times. It was originally intended to provide income supplement for men for about 13 years and for women for about 15 years. That was the life expectancy for 65-year-olds in 1935. Of course, Americans now live more than a decade longer. When you look at the baby boomers who were polled, you find that 1 in 3 have $25,000 or less in their retirement savings right now. Many of them already are thinking of extending their retirement dates. In fact, Northwestern Mutual estimates that nearly 1 in 4 will retire at age 70 or older. Because of medical advances, people between the ages of 65 and 70 are often fortunately able to work longer. But the bigger issue is not whether they are able, but rather whether they are willing to work. Given the option, most Americans would like to kick back and retire at 65. The latest surveys about retirement savings make that less likely. So we'll probably observe a graying of the workforce. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Talking about the book, The Dawn of Christianity, How God Used Simple Fishermen, Soldiers, and Prostitutes to Transform the World. Robert Hutchinson is our guest. It is published by Thomas Nelson. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we have information about it. So if you'd like to get it in hardback or Kindle, I really would encourage you to get a hardback because of all the great pictures there that would help you understand the context. It is available on our website, pointofview.net. Robert, let's, if we can, go to Jesus standing on the lake shore, calling for these individuals to become fishers of men. Tell us more.
Well, one of the things that really strikes me, and I don't think is emphasized enough, is that Jesus had a specific plan, and he really did intend, in my opinion, to found a movement. And in the early years, scholars call this the Jesus movement, but it's clear that he intended this to go and continue in time and spread across the entire world. And so I think he's still calling us today, and that movement still exists, and that's what we call the Christian church. And for a long time, people used to deny that. They used to say that Jesus really didn't intend to found a church. And I think he absolutely did, and I think the evidence is overwhelming that he did, and that it started very small with just groups of siblings and friends, and as Rodney Stark points out in his books, it quickly spread like wildfire throughout the entire Mediterranean, and it basically transformed the world and continues to this day. So I just wanted to make that come alive and show how that kind of happened. And I had that wonderful scene where at Tagba where Jesus calls Peter and invites him to become a fisher of men. The more I studied this, the more I just was overwhelmed by a sense of the historicity of all this, of this actually happening, because being in the place at the time and looking at the recent archaeological discoveries, it just overwhelms you, the plausibility of everything. That doesn't mean it's hard, it's not easy, or that it's easy to piece everything together and make a coherent story. And I think everybody would to try and do that sometime is try and actually take the Gospels and then try and work out your own putting it all together and try and make the pieces fit and come up with a coherent story, because it's difficult to do, but it actually teaches you a lot.
One of the things I appreciate, again, I wish this were television where we could show all the pictures, because you show a typical boat. Of course, we've had what was called the Jesus boat that was found in the mud. You have a picture of where it's most likely that John the Baptist baptized him, and I've actually baptized believers there. You have pictures of the Mount of Olives. You have the actual stone staircase, which were the ones that Jesus and all of the disciples walked up and down, most likely even where Peter actually gave the message during Pentecost. You have pictures of the silver coin that is very similar to the one that Jesus used, and all the way up to, of course, the old city of Jerusalem, and even leading into the Passover meal, the Last Supper. So as we go through this, we can follow with tremendous precision where Jesus was, what he said, and then the record that we have, and then we can go to those geographical locations, and many of them still look somewhat like they did even in the first century, don't they?
Absolutely. And when you actually are trying to put the story together, like, well, where was Jesus in Jerusalem? When would he have said this? It becomes even more obvious, because there were really only like two places in Jerusalem where a large group of people could gather. It was a very dense city, a lot like the way it is today. The old city of Jerusalem with narrow streets, and there's not a lot of places for people to gather, but there are two. And one is the Pool of Siloam, and the other is the so-called Rabbi Steps at the foot of the temple, and in the Gospels, where they describe Jesus' confrontations with the Pharisees and the crowds in Jerusalem before the cleansing of the temple, that I am convinced is exactly where that happened. Jesus was on the top of the Rabbi Steps, where thousands, if not tens of thousands of people could have gathered and heard him debate the Pharisees. And when you really study the archaeological layout of Jerusalem, everything starts to fit together. It really starts to make sense. Yes, he was probably on the Rabbi Steps when this happened, and during these debates with the Pharisees, then the moment came, and they went through the underground tunnel that brought you up into the top of the temple area, and that's where the confrontation with the money changers and everything happened. So really, when you look at the archaeology of it and you look at the layout of the city, it all fits together in a way that I don't think people really realize.
And again, let's talk about some other steps, because you also have the steps leading up to basically the house of Caiaphas. A lot of people say, I want to walk where Jesus walked on the Via Dolorosa or whatever. Well, that's really probably closer, because we know where the house of Caiaphas is. We've seen the prison. We've seen the steps. And so whether you're talking about the trial or then the ultimate persecution and crucifixion and resurrection, there are some places where we can actually still see the steps where Jesus walked.
Yes, absolutely. Those steps are absolutely considered authentic by most archaeologists. They may have been replaced over the centuries. They may not be the actual steps, but that's definitely the staircase leading up to the house of Caiaphas. But every year they're finding more and more stuff. They found the palace of Herod in 2015. They finally unearthed the palace of Herod, Herod the Great, where a lot of people now believe that was where Jesus was interrogated by Pilate, and not in the Antonia fortress, which was a tower that guarded the palace precincts. And so that radically changes what the Via Dolorosa, the way of the cross, would have been. That's one of the big changes that archaeology has made in an attempt to reconstruct on a minute-to-minute basis what actually happened. And I'm convinced that's probably exactly what happened. Jesus was interrogated in King Herod the Great's palace, which was the Roman Praetorium at the time, and not in the Antonia fortress, which meant the walk to Golgotha was actually much shorter than people used to think.
Well, and that brings us to, of course, the tomb. First of all, even before you get to that, there is also the tomb of the prophets. And one time I had a chance to go in there on the Mount of Olives. But this, of course, leads to where the tomb is. You can have a big debate about that one way or the other. In some respects, I'm glad that we don't necessarily have confirmation on that because, as you well know, almost any time something seems to be or is considered to be the actual whatever, we almost always see a shrine built and a church built on top of it. So that is, again, one of the other very important issues as well. Where was Jesus buried? And, of course, the fact is he's no longer in the tomb in the first place.
Yes. I mean, that's a big debate. A lot of people like the garden tomb. They think it first is prettier. And
yes.
But I think the traditional tomb is probably more likely, but it's obviously not a big issue of theological import. But when you try and write a book to reconstruct what actually happened, you got to kind of make those kinds of decisions. And what I try to do in my book is, rather than just be dogmatic about it and say this is what happened, I try and say, well, there is debate about this, but this is what I think is most likely.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, I want to spend just a little bit of time. Obviously, we put Jesus in the tomb, but we'll get him out, and that will be the resurrection. And then a whole section that you have written about the beginning of persecution, and that is the Sanhedrin and the martyrdom of Stephen, the ministry of Peter. Of course, we've got to get into Paul as well. And so whether we look at what is happening here in Jerusalem, or pretty soon we're going to move to Caesarea Maritima, we're going to eventually move to Europe as well and see the expansion of the gospel. We're going to look at a little bit more of that as well. And so I do commend to you this book because it would be just a great resource. Whether you've been able to go to the Holy Land or not, I think you will find it very helpful. Since we're talking about archaeology, one of the booklets we've been making available is on archaeology because last year was really a very significant year in archaeology. So there's some great resources there that you might want to get a hold of through us at Point of View. And most importantly, let me also mention that we have a link to roberthutchinson.com. And so if you want to know more about all sorts of things that he has been writing, there are books, there are articles, there's a YouTube channel. Maybe you'd like to have him come speak sometime. You'd like to know a little bit more about some of the issues he's been writing about. It's all on our website, pointofview.net. When we come back, we'll spend a little bit of time looking at some of the other aspects of this book. The resurrection, the advancement of the gospel through the apostles, the beginning of persecution, and then just the remarkable expansion of the Jesus movement and how that took place. If nothing else, we can learn some of these lessons from the first century as we apply them to our 21st century, because in many ways our world is very much the world like the world that actually the gospel was presented into. So let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation with Robert Hutchinson right after this.
There's an old saying that the first casualty in war is truth. Maybe that helps you understand what's happening in America right now. Thankfully, it's not a war with bullets, but there is a war for control. Control of the country and control of your pocketbook. Truth is under fire, but you can help turn the tide by supporting truth. Join the Truth Team at Point of View Radio. Learn how you can make a difference at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Don't let truth become a casualty on your watch. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151.
So what would you do with an extra $500 a month in your budget? Pay off loans, save it, do something fun? Well, it's something you may need to think about if you become a member of MediShare. MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry, and it works. You can save big time on your healthcare costs, and you don't have to pay for things you don't believe in either. Find out more. Call 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40. 855-SHARE-40.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Robert Hutchinson. Again, the earlier book, Searching for Jesus. This one is out, The Dawn of Christianity, How God Used Simple Fishermen, Soldiers, and Prostitutes to Transform the World. And so, if nothing else, Robert, let's now realize that Jesus is killed on the cross. His death is certified by the Romans. He is placed in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, wrapped very quickly in various linens and spices. And then a stone is rolled against the tomb. And, of course, you have the Roman guard. And then reports start coming that the tomb is empty and that the disciples have seen the risen Jesus. Talk us about, take us through that whole scenario that is kind of the middle part of your book.
Well, it's hard when you're trying to be an historian to reconstruct this because there are minor details in the Gospels, but it's very, very clear that the overwhelming testimony is that the women found the empty tomb and that they encountered an angel or perhaps two angels. And that evening, Jesus appeared to his disciples in the room of the Last Supper. The problem for modern people is they'd find that incredible. And so there's kind of two ways of trying to approach it. Some people try to prove it historically that with historical proofs to show the plausibility of this. And that's kind of my approach. And other people say that you kind of have to take this on faith because we don't have enough corroborating evidence, or the amount of information about the resurrection appearances is relatively small in the total context of the Gospels. So I just acknowledge that with people when people ask me this on radio shows and so on. Where's the overwhelming proof for this? And I always say there is not overwhelming proof that's going to convince an absolute skeptic that has his mind closed, but there's plenty of proof for people that have an open mind and are willing to accept the testimony of other people.
One of the things you also talk about is that, of course, we have the record in the Gospels, but now let's go into 1 Corinthians, because Paul then gives us records of some things that are not in the Gospels. The appearance to Paul and the appearance to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, although some have fallen asleep, appears to James and to all the apostles. So you have Jesus on earth for 40 days. And so that takes us, of course, to the ascension. And, of course, that's the top of the Mount of Olives. And that is then followed with a preaching by Peter before the onlookers. And he doesn't do that off in a corner and another area, but basically right there in Jerusalem, and says these are individuals that have indeed seen him, and this was not done in a corner, and that this is, again, something that we are actually testifying to you right here in Jerusalem itself.
Yes, and one thing that's always made me wonder was, why were the early followers of Jesus persecuted at all? They did not reject the Torah. They continued to worship in the temple. They continue to be good Jews. There are plenty of other organizations or groups that were openly treasonous, like the Essenes, that basically said the entire temple establishment was illegitimate and corrupt, and they went out into the desert and practiced what they thought was pure Judaism. Yet the Christians were the ones that were really singled out, and the Gospels make clear, and also the works of Josephus, that they were actively persecuted from the very beginning. And my question was always, why? Why were they so persecuted? And I think it comes down to the fact that they were invoking the name of Jesus in the same way that Jews invoke the name of God, Hashem, which is still the word that Jews refer to, the Orthodox Jews refer to God as Hashem, the name. And Jesus was the name before whom all people must bend a knee. And I think this struck the Orthodox Jews of the time as absolutely blasphemous and a very, very big threat. and that was why they were persecuted so much.
Well, let's get into that because that's part 3 of your book. You know, John 15:18, Jesus says, "If the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you." And so we have examples of miraculous healings that are taking place with Peter and John. And we have all sorts of things happening. You have then an introduction to Saul of Tarsus. Of course, we now know him as Paul. You have the first martyr, which is Stephen. And again, we can place much of that in the historical and archaeological context, can't we?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's even a few places around Jerusalem where they think the stoning of Stephen actually occurred.
Mm-hmm.
And once again, the reason that he was stoned was because he had his vision of seeing Jesus at the right hand of God, and that was just too much for the Jewish establishment of that time. That was just simply blasphemy, and that was why he was executed. But that does raise interesting questions, which is if the Jewish Sanhedrin had the power to put Stephen to death, why didn't they have the power to put Jesus to death and turn him over to the Romans and so on? But I just raised that kind of as an aside.
Kind of interesting. Well, let's continue on because one of the things I thought was kind of interesting is, you know, you read about Philip and the eunuch, Ethiopian eunuch, probably took place in the Negev desert. But again, you can see that the people of Ethiopia had a connection to Israel and Judaism for millennia. So it's not surprising that when he comes alongside this individual, this is an individual reading out of the Old Testament, and he asks him, "Do you understand what you're reading?"
Yes. I mean, that, once again, the thing that strikes me when you try and retell a story like this in a modern way is how plausible it all is, how much it just makes a lot of sense, just as a story. None of this strikes me as fictional embellishment or legends or something like that. It all seems very, very plausible. When you go back and try and research the history of the Ethiopians and their connection to Jerusalem, which they have had for millennia, and so today the Falashim from Ethiopia are considered Jews by the people of Israel and are allowed to come as under the law of return. All of this stuff is verified by history and what we know of ancient people. So it was just a very, very fun project for me to research this. I learned a ton, and I was forced to go back and research things that I glossed over as I was writing the book, or as I was growing up reading the Gospels that I hadn't really researched, and that's why it's a fun book.
Well, let's take one more just before we take a break, and that is Caesarea. This was something outside of Jerusalem, and it was kind of a place built first by Herod and then taken over by the Romans. But here you see Peter being brought to this kind of foreign place, if you will, not a place where a Jewish person would willingly go, although later Paul goes there under arrest, but goes there, and that is the baptism of Cornelius. And whenever we take people to Caesarea, they are just shocked at how much is there, and it gives you a real sense of what it was like to have been a Roman soldier in that place, or even to have been coming there as a seafarer or as an individual that was a sailor or a merchant, because much of it still remains, and you can get in your mind's eye exactly what it must have been like for Peter and then later for Paul to be there in Caesarea.
Oh, yes. It just blows your mind when you go to Caesarea. It's a beautiful place. It's right on the Mediterranean. They've reconstructed a lot of the ancient sites. The theater is there facing the ocean. The Hippodrome, which is where they had the chariot races. And so it's very easy when you try and reconstruct what happened to Caesarea to be able to describe the geography of the place, especially if you've been there. You can just see it. And Caesarea, by the way, was also the site for the breakout of the Jewish war against the Romans that led to the destruction of Jerusalem. It was in Caesarea where their conflict broke out between the Jewish community and Greeks and Romans over a synagogue, and the Greeks sacrificed in front of a synagogue a pig as a kind of an insult, and a fight broke out, and the Romans responded by massacring practically the entire Jewish community, in Caesarea, and that's what triggered the revolt against Rome that led to the destruction of Jerusalem. So.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about that last section briefly, the expansion of the Jesus movement, because, of course, then you have the establishment of so many churches, and you can go to what it looked like in Antioch, what it looked like in Corinth, what it looked like in Philippi, and many others, and get a real sense of how this expansion of the Jesus movement eventually took over the Roman Empire and was established as part of Western civilization. So it's all part of just an outstanding book, The Dawn of Christianity. It is published by our friends at Thomas Nelson. If you'd like to know a little bit more, we have information about that on our website, pointofview.net. We'll continue our conversation with Robert Hutchinson right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Robert Hutchinson with us for a few more minutes as we talk about the book, The Dawn of Christianity. And I might just mention, this was published by Thomas Nelson. You might want to also look for the previous book, Searching for Jesus. And another one I might just mention, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Bible. And those are all ones that Robert has written about. But let's, if we can, talk about this idea of going and making disciples of all nations, the Great Commission, because then you have some chapters that help us understand that these house churches that were developed in Macedonia and Asia Minor eventually spread throughout the Western world. And as a result, this was taking the Great Commission to more than just Judea and Samaria, but to the uttermost parts of the world.
Yes. I mean, that was the big issue when they started. Was this movement primarily to the Jews, or was this movement meant for the entire world? And at first, Paul and Peter also reached out to Jewish synagogues where there were pagans who were called God-fearers, who basically wanted to who believed in Judaism, believed in the God of Israel, but didn't want to fully convert because that meant circumcision for the men. Mm-hmm. And so they kind of were on the periphery. And so their natural place to go when they were first preaching the gospel were to Jewish synagogues. But they started encountering increased hostility there because of the radical claims they were making about Jesus. And then they started to bring the message directly to pagan communities and had tremendous success with that. And so that basically created the crisis that led to the First Council of Jerusalem, or the only Council of Jerusalem, over whether you first had to convert to Judaism before you could become a follower of the way, or if that wasn't required. And that had to be hammered out in the First Council of the Church in about 49 A.D. So.
And again, a very good chapter there on the Council of Jerusalem. But then you have one of these ossuaries, and again, there's a lot of debate about this, but if nothing else, the inscription seems to say James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. And if it is authentic, it is the first archaeological confirmation of Jesus of Nazareth. And, of course, we've seen so many confirmations of Pontius Pilate, Herod, you name whatever you need. This has been just a banner couple of years in archaeology. And, of course, we've had a lot of historical evidence, but it's just been interesting to see how some of these archaeological finds just once again reinforce and confirm the historicity and the accuracy of the New Testament.
Yeah, the James ossuary it just blows you away because all the ossuaries really blow you. They found the ossuary of Caiaphas. That no one disputes the ossuary of Caiaphas whatsoever. There is debate over the James ossuary, whether it's a forgery or if it's actually authentic, but there's the people added extra words to the inscriptions on it, and that's been actually adjudicated in court in Israel, and it's still disputed. There are a number of evangelical scholars like Ben Worthington and others who accept it as authentic. Some people don't think it's authentic, but either way, it's just an amazing time for biblical archaeology. And I wanted to get into all that stuff in this book and tell people that while still telling the story. I was always interested in the details, like how much did a boat trip cost? How much did it cost to go to Cyprus? And so I spent a lot of time trying to work out things like that, like, how much money did Paul and Barnabas need to make this expedition? And there was a UCLA computer program, I think, or maybe it was Stanford University, that actually figured it cost about 237 denarii per person in over 2 months. So basically it was $18,900 each, or about $37,000 the equivalent to make the two trips for the first missionary journey. So I was always interested in the practical details.
And just fascinating. And one more I might just add, this is in my little booklet on archaeology. A lot of people say, well, how accurate is some of this? Because Luke has been the one, as you well know, that's always been attacked. Because, first of all, he wrote the Gospel of Luke, but he also wrote the book of Acts. And Colin Hemmer, in his book, documents the fact that Luke, especially in the latter chapters of the book of Acts, there's 84 different facts in the book of Acts that have been confirmed by historical and archaeological research. We're talking about nautical details, names of gods, designation of magistrates, proper names and titles. The more we dig in the ancient Near East and find archaeological evidence, the more we find various historical references. We time and time again, Robert, don't we find just how accurate the New Testament was? And if indeed it is accurate in the historical details, maybe indeed we can also understand that it's accurate in terms of its supernatural and spiritual details as well, don't you think?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm blown away by just every year. Just this year there was another discovery of a roadway built by Pontius Pilate in Jerusalem. They were uncovering stuff like this every year. That doesn't mean it's not difficult to fit all the pieces together when you try to tell a kind of a harmonized view of the story, which people try and do when they create. Instead of having four Gospels, you just have one story. It's still difficult to get it all fit together, and there's various explanations for how you can make those pieces jive and so on. But you're right. The archaeological evidence is confirming people, places, and beliefs in the Gospels. Almost every week, there's something new is discovered.
Well, again, the archaeological booklet that we have, just one that, again, says if you got 10 minutes, we'd want to tell you a few things. But again, if you want to spend some real time getting into the New Testament, the Gospels and the book of Acts in particular, and begin to work from the first teaching of Jesus all the way to the final establishment of some of these churches in Asia Minor, this book will take you through that. You'll learn a lot about the various archaeological discoveries that have already been made, some of the historical inferences, and material that is not in the Bible simply because when this was written, people understood that. They had been there. They knew what it was talking about. But now in our 21st century, looking back, sometimes it gives you another perspective, helps you understand a little bit more of what was being communicated at the time in terms of the life and time of Jesus, of Peter, and of Paul. So, Robert, I appreciate the good work that you've done, first of all, in searching for Jesus, as well as in this book, The Dawn of Christianity. But one more time, let me mention your website, because we have that on our website, pointofview.net, and people can click on your picture or simply go to roberthutchinson.com. And what will they find when they land on the website?
Oh, they'll have links to all my books, all my articles, my podcast, way to contact me, anything they want.
And I might just mention, you've got a number of books, you've got a number of articles, you've got a YouTube channel, and most importantly, if people might want to have you come and speak to their church or learn a little bit more about some of this so that they can take this and apply it in a more effective way, all available at your website, roberthutchinson.com. So, Robert, thank you for once again joining us here on Point of View, and I always look forward to the next opportunity.
Thank you very much, Kerby. It's been an honor. Thanks very much.
Well, that's all we have for the book. It is called The Dawn of Christianity. It is published by Thomas Nelson. I noticed that it is very inexpensive for a hardback book, so you might want to check it out, and we have links there. Of course, if you go to the book at the end, it has all of his information, his website, his address, and others. And if you've always said, I'd like to know more about the Holy Land, I probably will never get there, but I'd be glad to read a book and look at all the pictures that on the diagrams that are there. This is perhaps the book you want. And if you've ever been to Israel, it will be just a great way to put some of the bits and pieces that you collected over the years into one coherent way. So again, the book is entitled The Dawn of Christianity, How God Used Simple Fishermen, Soldiers, and Prostitutes to Transform the World. We need to take a break, and when we come back, we have some more to cover, and we will do so. But feel free to go to the website, pointofview.net. You'll find all the links necessary, and we'll be back right after these important messages.
So when people first hear about MediShare, they have questions. Some good ones, like, what is it? Well, MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry. It's not health insurance. It's a different way of doing things, which leads us to this question. Why do so many become MediShare members? Two big reasons. They save a lot. The typical family saves $500 a month, and they feel great about it. With MediShare, you aren't forced to pay for things you don't believe in. Find out more. 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40.
It seems we can't get through a day without hearing how science has been corrupted to support political goals. Media entities have sold out truth for the sake of favored narratives. Even some religious groups have abandoned the Bible to support things based on feelings. So who can you trust? Kerby Anderson and the Point of View Truth Team are your source for real news. Learn how you can make a difference by joining the team at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. In a world of unending fog, Point of View is a shining light. Do your part at pointofview.net/team or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
You know, I've often said that one of the most powerful arguments for the truthfulness of the gospel are the changed lives and the remarkable conversion of individuals and their ongoing testimony. But one of the arguments sometimes against the gospel are the lives of individuals who claim to be Christians, and maybe they are, but they live very carnal, compromised, hypocritical lives. And so we're going to spend some time talking about that today as we talk about this new book, Why I Still Believe, a former atheist reckoning with the bad reputation Christians give a good God, and how important this is right now as we've seen some high-profile individuals say, you know, I really have such doubts that I'm not even sure I'm a Christian anymore. I'm walking away from the Christian faith. Mary Jo Sharp, who is the author, is a former atheist, came to faith in the Pacific Northwest. She lives up there now, but experienced this up there in the Pacific Northwest in kind of a post-Christian culture, then was transported into kind of a Bible Belt culture, and she's going to talk about some of that with us today. It's really kind of more of a narrative, but as you well know, she is an individual that has really worked in this area of apologetics, serves as the assistant professor of apologetics at Houston Baptist University. He's also the founder and director of Confident Christianity Apologetics Ministry. And you might remember that she and people like Nancy Pearcey and a number of others appeared on the cover of Christianity Today, The Unexpected Defenders. Might mention, by the way, that Nancy Pearcey, as well as J. Warner Wallace and Sean McDowell and Paul Copan and Mark Middleberg and Gary Habermas and all sorts of people have been on this program, have endorsed the book as well. It's published by our friends at Zondervan. And Mary Jo Sharp, welcome back to Point of View.
Hey, it's so good to be with you today, Kerby.
Let's, if we can, just take your story for just a few minutes. I've known bits and pieces of your story. This book helped me put it all together. I go to Oregon every single year. My wife is from there. One of my degrees is from there. And so that used to be the most secular state in the country. Now I think Vermont is, and I go to Vermont every year because I'm speaking in Vermont, usually in New York. So I know what it's like to be in this post-Christian culture, almost a secular culture. But in the midst of that culture and in the midst of your family, you became a Christian. But tell us the story.
Yeah, so as you pointed out, I grew up in somewhat of a post-Christian culture. So I kind of have to keep telling people that because my name's Mary Jo, which sounds very Southern, and I've spent a long time in the South, so people think that I was, raised around this culture of Christianity, which is more true to, a Southern feel in the United States. But that's not my experience. I tell people, there wasn't a church on every street corner. And I say to my Texas friends, nor a Tex-Mex restaurant on every street corner. They get that. There's one everywhere. So, so that's the cultural milieu in which I'm raised. People aren't talking about Jesus to everybody. Religion's considered more private. They're a little bit more of relativist. And that's my background, that's my culture. But I grew up in a family who had left church when I was too young to remember, and didn't, my dad didn't turn back. He went full bore into just nature and science shows and into taking us camping on the weekend. And he was a huge fan of Carl Sagan. So I got a rich upbringing in nature and science and in a love of the things that humans could do through the sciences. But I also had parents who were very into the arts, and I have a music background. Mm-hmm. Actually have a music degree in my background. And So I was affected by not only what I was seeing in nature and the beauty I saw in the natural realm, and the power I saw in the sciences, like the raw power of the sun or the stars that were even more powerful than our sun. But I also was impacted by the beauty of what humans could do in the arts. And I began in my later years, when I was getting old enough to start to think about meaning, purpose, and value. I began to wonder what this was all for. We just live, we die, and that's all there is to it, because we're on this planet that's the pale blue dot in a far-off corner of the universe and relatively insignificant. And I began to wonder what makes me think that I have meaning, purpose, and value, ultimate meaning, purpose, and value. Where am I getting ideas like this from? What is this beautiful musical piece that we're performing? What is this for? And so at that point in my life, which I'm an older teenager, I have a high school band director who I greatly respect, who is burdened to share his faith with me, and he hasn't shared his faith with anyone. So this is stepping out. This is courage for him. He's got something that he's never done before, and he's a public school teacher, and I'm a student. So he's worried about getting in trouble as well. But he's so burdened for me that my senior year of high school, when I'm about to graduate, he gives me a gift, a graduation gift. And one is his conducting baton, which was very special to me as going into music. And then the other one was a NIV one-year Bible. And he handed it to me, and he said, when you go off to college, you're going to have hard questions. I hope you turn to this. And I was not sure what I would find in that Bible. But it did change things for me, and I started to read it. And what I found in the Bible was that source of meaning, purpose, and value, the source behind all that beauty, that it did make sense. There's an intelligence behind it. So I didn't become a Christian yet. I went off to college at that point, following a teacher from the University of Oregon. I went to college in Oklahoma. So I began to visit churches. And it's funny because we talk about how so many kids leave the faith. They go off to college and they leave the faith. And here I was going off to college, and I was searching for faith, or searching for what this was all about. And I eventually, after visiting many churches, I eventually found one in which I heard the good news of the Savior for mankind, and that made sense to me. It made sense of my experience of goodness and justice and beauty and all these things. And so at that point, I was ready to trust Jesus for my salvation. That's how I became a Christian.
Well, and again, I love the fact that you say at one point, when you read the Bible, it was not this goofy portrayal of Christians found in The Simpsons, or some kind of piously romanticized view of clergy found in the old movies, and you saw some authenticity there. But when we come back from the break, I want to talk about that, because that leads right into the first chapter about hypocrisy. But also you mentioned beauty, because a little bit later we're going to get into that, because I know in chapter 9 you talk about beauty, and as an individual that backpacked all the way through California and Oregon and Washington and rode horses through Montana and things like that, I can appreciate that as well, especially when then all of a sudden you're at very flat Oklahoma and you don't have that around you anymore. And all of a sudden, people that you think should be mentoring you because they've been Christians for a long time, you're struck with their hypocrisy. And then you take us into questions about a variety of other issues, some of these deep theological issues like God and evil, but others as well. So we're going to get into this in a little bit more significance. It is a narrative in some respects, but it also, as you go along, teaches you about some other individuals that we've had on this program over the years. One in particular that I was talking about recently with our good friend Ravi Zacharias Nabel Qureshi. He shows up in here as well. So we'll talk about a lot of different things that I think you will enjoy. This is a book that might even be helpful to pass on to somebody that you're witnessing to who's an atheist that maybe would appreciate this journey, or maybe for someone that's got some real questions about whether or not Christianity is true when they look at some of the people that don't look like they're really very good Christians. So we'll come back and talk about that with Mary Jo Sharp right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A significant percentage of Americans have little or no retirement savings. That means that future debates about Social Security may become even more contentious than they have been in the past. As I've discussed in previous commentaries, the only thing in the Social Security Trust Fund are IOUs. Sometime in the future, government may not have the necessary funds for all the baby boomers who are currently retiring. A report from Northwestern Mutual found that 1 in 5 Americans have no retirement savings at all. The survey also found that 2/3 of people with a savings account or retirement plan are certain that their money will run out sooner than they hoped it would. That means they would be totally dependent on Social Security. Even when implemented, Social Security wasn't intended to fund people's retirement for such long times. It was originally intended to provide income supplement for men for about 13 years and for women for about 15 years. That was the life expectancy for 65-year-olds in 1935. Of course, Americans now live more than a decade longer. When you look at the baby boomers who were polled, you find that 1 in 3 have $25,000 or less in their retirement savings right now. Many of them already are thinking of extending their retirement dates. In fact, Northwestern Mutual estimates that nearly 1 in 4 will retire at age 70 or older. Because of medical advances, people between the ages of 65 and 70 are often fortunately able to work longer. But the bigger issue is not whether they are able, but rather whether they are willing to work. Given the option, most Americans would like to kick back and retire at 65. The latest surveys about retirement savings make that less likely. So we'll probably observe a graying of the workforce. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Mary Jo Sharp as we talk about the book Why I Still Believe. One of the chapters in the beginning was hypocrisy. You know, when we had Dave Kinnaman on this program talking about his book Unchristian, he points out that when you interview individuals that either were Christians and have left or aren't Christians in the first place, they say, well, I'm not because Christians are hypocritical, they're judgmental, they're anti-LGBT, they're anti-science, whatever it might be. But one of the ones that shows up and always has is hypocrisy. And you ran into that pretty quickly, didn't you?
Yes, I did. Actually, I think I quote David Kinnaman there in one of the chapters, one of those early chapters when
Yes.
I'm talking about hypocrisy, right, chapter 1. And so my first encounter, so I talk about my experience of being drawn to Christ through this great beauty and how I'm, the goodness in the world and the truth that I'm finding. So when I'm getting ready to go to church after professing faith in Jesus, my first experience of going to the church, I was married at the time. I was young married, and so I'm talking to my husband who has a background in Christianity, and I'm trying to figure out basic things like what to wear. I'm nervous because I'm entering a culture of which I'm unfamiliar. I'm entering into a Southern evangelical culture church, and so I'm kind of a mess of emotions. I'm really excited about my commitment. I'm worried about what people back home will think of me. This is a new environment. I feel like the new kid in class. And so I'm asking my husband, like, am I dressed appropriately? Is this great? I only own 2 dresses. I'm a poor college student. But so he's like, you're fine. Let's just go. So we show up to the church, and I include in the book just like several instances from a pattern that I saw in the church, but this is one of those instances where I come to church on the first day. This is, that I'm a new believer, and this is when I'm going to profess to the church, that I'm a new believer and I'm going to join the church. And as we're walking in, the pastor's wife has positioned herself right at the sanctuary door to greet everybody. And I walk up and I'm expecting to get, I heard you came to Christ last week, and that's amazing. Welcome. But what I get instead was her smile dropped, and she said, the very first thing was, "Oh, honey, we need to get you better clothing." Not quite what I expected.
No, exactly.
Yeah, and it was confusing. And, what happens as that's one instance. There's much worse things that happen, but I think what was important to me in sharing that was that it was from the very beginning of my involvement with church that I began to see this sort of judgmentalism and hypocrisy that Christians would profess this moral standard, but they themselves wouldn't even live up to it. And that I saw a pattern of Christians doing this, and that began to cause distrust in me of people who said that they believed in God. And over time, I then began to transfer that distrust over into what is it that I believe about God. And I started to distrust God himself, and that led me to questioning whether or not he existed, why I believed what I did, and it launched me into a search for answers to the questions about God's existence.
Well, and also that's what led you into apologetics. I remember when you said, I'm interested in apologetics, and Roger leaves the room to do some research on the word apologetics. What in the world is that? And in some respects, it was because you weren't getting the answers. There, you talk about, for example, people raising questions and saying, well, what about this in terms of young earth, whatever. So I'll just believe. And it is something that, of course, led me. It was me reading, things like C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity, and things like that said, okay, this evidence is mounting up. And then you spend time in the church world where they really aren't educated in just the evidence for the faith. And they say, well, just believe. Well, I need a little bit more than that. And if I'm going to share this with my friends, neighbors, and coworkers, my fellow students, I need a lot more than that. And so I know that's what launched you into that area as well.
Yeah, exactly. That was one of the things I saw in the church. And I know it sounds like we're doing a lot of condemnation towards the church. It's just trying to share what happened and the experiences and why I think some people do accuse the church of hypocrisy. One of those reasons is because of the lack of intellectual engagement with the questions of our time. And even when I would try to push people a little bit deeper on those questions, and not doing it in a way that was overtly aggressive, because I was a pastor's wife. So I was always very cautious about how I engaged in a Sunday school class or with other people. So, I would ask questions and people would push back or they would get defensive. They wouldn't even tell me, I don't know, but let's see if we can find the answer. It was like you described, it was this sort of a feel of anti-intellectualism, and it was very unsatisfying for me. And I felt very alone because of that, specifically because as a pastor's wife, I didn't feel I had space to explore these kinds of questions.
Well, and again, when you saw people like, let's say, talk about a few, certainly that those that maybe were addressing some of those issues, like Craig and maybe a few of the others, I've mentioned Nabel Qureshi and others, for the first time you're saying, okay, this is helpful, and it's going to be necessary perhaps more, Mary Jo, than ever before, because there was a time in which we were sort of a Christian culture, and you just say, well, the Bible says, and everybody goes, okay. Now people go, well, why should I trust the Bible? Why do I even believe there's a God? Why do I believe there's any revolution? Why do I even believe there's any truth? And so we're going to have to be more able to answer those questions, don't you think, in the 21st century than we ever had to, say, in the 19th or 20th century?
Yeah, as the culture moves away from that Christian foundation, from that biblical truth, and even from understanding what that is, even knowing what's in the Bible or what Christians profess, we're going to have to be people who not only know what we believe as Christians, so we need to know our essential Christian doctrine, but we also need to know why we believe it. And apologetics really helps us with that because it makes a case for belief in God, so that there are philosophical reasons, there are scientific evidences, there are some of these reasons out there for why we believe in God that, for me, I hadn't experienced in the church. I hadn't experienced anybody giving these arguments. And that was, I think, when it says in chapter 3, when I encountered my first debate, I'm so surprised to hear William Lane Craig making these arguments, because I'd never heard him before. But as you also mentioned, when I finally do go off to get a degree in apologetics as part of this process to answer my doubts, I meet people who are doing this, who are actively engaged in answering the toughest questions philosophically, theologically, that are out there. And that really impressed me, because I actually told Roger, I don't think I included this in the book, but I actually told Roger when I went off to Biola and I was in classes and all these people were spending all this money just to study these hard questions, I said, I think I found the church. They're hiding out in La Mirada. He was like, Mary Jo, come on.
But again, to study with people like William Lane Craig, Gary Habermas, and all the others, I'm older than you, and so I can remember a time when it was Norm Geisler and I doing some debates, and then we had Ravi Zacharias, who was one of Norm's students, and now, I just look again at the people that are actually endorsing this. Of course, there was Josh McDowell, but now you have Sean McDowell, and you have J. Warner Wallace, and you have all sorts of other people, not to mention the fact that I mention you and Nancy Pearcey on a regular basis, because there used to be a time when, apologetics, that's for those guys, those geeks, those nerds, and there's no place for women. And I appreciate the fact that you and a variety of other women, by the way, at Houston Baptist and other places are addressing these issues, because we're going to have to really be ready to always give an answer of the hope that is in us. And in the past, that answer sometimes was fairly simple. Well, this is what the Bible has to say, and maybe here's some research you can look at. But now, given the fact that we're up against the disciples of the so-called new atheist, that the fastest growing demographic right now of the younger generation are the nuns, those people that on a survey actually say atheist, agnostic, or no preference, we're going to have to know these answers even more so. So we need to take a break. When we come back, I do want to encourage people during the break to click on your picture, because that will take them to confidentchristianity.com. And I first want to talk about some of the great resources that you have there, books and other events that are part of that, the blog. And then we'll get back into some of the lessons, especially one, lessons from a sociopath and an ex-Muslim. And then we'll get into questions of good and evil and a couple of other topics. And this is just a fascinating book that I think you will really enjoy, simply because it shares, if you will, the kind of spiritual pilgrimage of Mary Jo Sharp. It has about 230 pages. It recommends different books and articles and videos after each one of the chapters at the back, so there's some great material there. So it would certainly be useful for you if you wanted to study it individually. But I know many of you that are listening probably have a small group, or maybe you lead a Bible fellowship or a Sunday school class. This might be a book that you would want to run through, as there are a number of chapters that you can cover, 12 different chapters, and we'll come back and talk about a few of the others. And it is published by Zondervan. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we also have a link on our website so that you can get it either in paperback or Kindle. And, of course, we also have a link to confidentchristianity.com. We'll talk more about what's on that website right after these important messages.
When you give to Point of View, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Pettit Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation with Mary Jo Sharp. The book is entitled Why I Still Believe. It is published by Zondervan. But if you'd like to know a little bit more about what Mary Jo Sharp is doing, you can go to confidentchristianity.com. And Mary Jo, for just a minute, let's, if we can, talk about what is available, because if people would like to follow your blog or listen to some other podcasts or maybe get some of your books or even schedule to speak, those are all available at your website, aren't they?
Yeah, they can go there and find, like you said, the blog where I'll be writing posts on various things that relate. Mostly right now I'll probably be relating to why I still believe in the hypocrisy issue in the church, along with some apologetics arguments. And then also I do try to link to other sites. So just like in the book where there's a list of resources that go with every chapter, I'm always about trying to get people out to the other resources that are there. And then they can find all of my books there as well, so they can click on that to see what all I've written or written in, and then obviously also look at inviting me for an event if you'd like to have me come and speak specifically on these issues we're dealing with of hypocrisy, of deconversion and doubt, those sorts of things as well. So you can find all of that on the website.
Very necessary, because we've seen high-profile individuals sometimes say, well, I've just started walking away from the Christian faith. And so I think the material that you present is so valuable, and this book is as well. But let's talk about some of the kind of people we run into. Chapter 5 talks about lessons from a sociopath and an ex-Muslim. You go out to a Mexican restaurant, and these are kind of scary people if you think about it, but there are some ways in which they had a very significant ministry in your life, didn't they?
Yeah, so I did meet Nabil Qureshi and David Wood my first year at Biola University in their apologetics degree program. They have a 2-week residency required on campus, and so part of the degree you go and you stay there, and that's when I met the guys. These two guys' personalities were pretty much as big as their statures. I mean, they are, anybody who knows them will know that's true. And one of the things that David and Nabil taught me as I met them and got to know them and started to do work with them, some people don't know that, like David, Nabil, and I were doing debates with Muslims early on in my own ministry, and that David and Nabil kind of thrust me onto the debate stage myself. That's who's responsible. I blame them.
Yes.
And the things that I really learned from them, for one, I really was impressed that David and Nabil took my theological and philosophical ideas with respect. They really respected me for what I was thinking and how I was thinking, and engaged me. And that was not an experience that I typically had in the church, especially with my fellow Christian male believers. And again, I don't want to diss my men, but it was a new experience for me to be so respected for my ideas by these two guys. That was one thing that really impressed me. But the other thing that I learned from them, since the book chapter is entitled Lessons from an Ex-Muslim and a Sociopath, was that David and Nabil taught me a lot about the selfishness of my own heart, that I really didn't want to be a public Christian. I didn't want to be public with any of my ideas, because I was raised in a culture where religion was more private. These ideas were more of, well, that's good for you, but kind of keep it to yourself because I have my own thing. And so I didn't like the idea that I met these two guys. They had a public target on their back because they were debating atheists and they're debating Muslims. And being in the public light, what was nervous for me, or what made me nervous, was that you could say anything. People could say anything about you, and you can't control the narrative, And that was something that I saw that these two guys did not seem to care about in any way or fashion. They knew God was in control. They believed in God with all their heart, mind, and soul, and they were going full bore into ministry. And so they showed me that people and God were more important than having the world be the way that I wanted it to be, having it in my control. So those were two of the many things that David and Nabil taught me. Obviously, Nabil taught me a lot about Islam and sacrifice, his sacrifice in coming to Christianity, in leaving a lot of, his family behind because they were not happy with that. So there are a lot of things I learned from those two guys.
I would think so. One of the other chapters I did want to focus on, debating good and evil, because, first of all, that is one of the issues that has been a perennial issue for why individuals walk away from the faith or don't believe that there's a good God in the first place. And these debates put you in some difficult situations as well to deal with pain and suffering, and even in your own personal experience. Share that if you might.
Yeah, so this is an important one to bring up alongside hypocrisy as well, because, first of all, the problem of evil remains as one of the greatest objections to belief in God. Hypocrisy is sneaking up there with it. That's why I really wanted to counter these two in a narrative. But so the problem of evil, in the book, you encounter it through my review of David's debate with an atheist on this very issue. And the atheist is asking this question about, the force of the problem of evil is related to the pain and suffering in the world. And for me, it's a difficult one to deal with because there's the theoretical aspect of it, and then there's the experiential side of it. So on the theoretical, we can give answers, and we can talk about why is evil in the world, how did it get here, how do we even define evil, how do we ground things like good and evil. But if we're talking to somebody who's currently suffering, they can look at us and say, hey, you don't know my suffering, you don't know what I'm going through. And so I'm always having this balance between the discussion on how do we ground things like good and evil, because everybody seems to believe in them and they talk about them as if they're real, like suffering is something that we shouldn't be, engaged in. We shouldn't suffer. And people talk with this sort of morally charged language when it comes to pain, suffering in the world. So it's a difficult balance to play. And when you present arguments from the problem of evil or why there's evil in the world and what God's doing about it, what he did through Jesus, sometimes we come across a little bit trite to people who are currently suffering. So my engagement with it is trying to walk through the fact that I know some theodicy. I know some answers as to why this is happening and to, how mankind has a good gift from God through free will and has used that in very destructive ways. In fact, it has led to our own deaths. But at the same time, I don't like the world that I see. I don't like the pain and suffering in the world. It bothers me. And so I say in the book, I'm never truly at home in this world with all this pain and suffering. And yet I know the beauty of what God has done in providing an answer to all of this. So it's just that balance of trying to handle the theoretical in light of the experiential.
And that's a good example of where we need to have some level of maturity and discernment, because when people ask that question, sometimes, it's out of a philosophical discussion, but most of the time it's out of some sense of pain. They've lost a loved one. They are struggling with some issue and they don't know how to address it. So you have to recognize there are different levels. And I mentioned C.S. Lewis earlier. He wrote The Problem of Pain to really address some of the theological issues related to how, if there's a good, all-loving, all-powerful God, is there evil in the world? Either he's not all-loving or he's not all-powerful, or he doesn't care, or something of that nature. There's an answer to that, and he gives a very good answer. But then you go to the book A Grief Observed, in which he talks about his own personal loss. And so you have to recognize that sometimes there's the philosophical answer, there's the emotional answer, and I think there is a sense of which some kind of Christian discernment and wisdom helps you understand which particular kind of answer you're going to give at that moment, and to do that with a great deal of compassion and sensitivity.
Yeah, definitely. And to remember, though, too, that for me, I had to set the experiences that I had with Christians in the church and their hypocrisy. The problem of evil just enlightened that for me as, this is why, that people they're going to continue to do wrong because we are all suffering. We're all in this situation. And so I'm going to continue to see the kinds of behaviors because this is a fallen human world. And the problem of evil really opened my eyes to saying, okay, but what do I believe about good and evil and where it comes from? What do I believe? Do I believe there is a standard to which we are all comparing everything? There's an objective point of reference, or do I believe that it's all relative to every individual? And I realized if I didn't have that objective reference point, no matter how I was suffering, no matter what was going on with my life, if I didn't have that objective reference point, I couldn't actually define things as actual suffering, as actual pain. I had no way to ground those ideas. And so that was encountering the problem of evil really helped me think through that and then apply it into my own experiences with the church.
Wow. Let's take a break, and when we come back, I think we'll come full circle because your chapter on the problem of beauty gets us back to, of course, something that was very instrumental in your salvation, but also because you and your husband have been able to return back to the beauty of the Pacific Northwest, you raise some other very important questions about that as well. And it's interesting that this issue of beauty is starting to surface even for those that speak to this issue of intelligent design as a real challenge. Matter of fact, that was something that apparently even Charles Darwin struggled with a little bit in The Origin of Species. We'll come back and get into that in more detail. This is all part of the book, though, Why I Still Believe. a former atheist reckoning with the bad reputation Christians give a good God. We'll continue our conversation with Mary Jo Sharp right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Mary Jo Sharp with us as we continue talking about her book, Why I Still Believe. And Mary Jo, I thought we might get into this issue of beauty. And I think really even surfaced when you had this particular course on cultural apologetics from John Mark Reynolds. Even more recently, we've had Dr. Paul Gould on talking about cultural apologetics. This is an area that I think we've neglected, but I really appreciate the fact that when you took his course and when others have talked about this importance of ethics and the value of beauty, just another aspect of something we can use to begin to bring about recognition of God's involvement in our lives. And sometimes we tend to do so many things from kind of a left hemisphere logical way. We ignore the right hemisphere cultural way. And as a musician, I think you certainly understand that as well as anyone.
Yeah, that was what Chapter 9 was on, was this sort of introduction to this argument in which I was drawn to God by the fact of beauty around me, and I was trying to figure out what it is for. What is this beauty for? And of course, as a teenager, I wouldn't have said it that way. That's me reflecting back on that time. But now I'm looking at it as I'm getting older. And one of the things that shocked me when I got into the church was sort of a lack of attention to a theology of beauty, or what it's there for, or what we're supposed to be doing with it. And I explore in my book. I'm sort of a new person into this field because apologetics hasn't done a lot of work in this. This is not one of our. I don't even know if this would be a thing, but a mainstream argument that you would find in apologetics. We're getting more and more into it, but. So I hadn't even encountered it really, and so I'm just encountering it through this book and through thinking on these matters through the program at Biola. And one of the profound things that one of my colleagues at Houston Baptist University said to me, Phil Talon, was he said, in evangelical Christianity, we view goodness as objective, and we view truth as objective. But, this third transcendental of God as him being objectively beautiful, we have sort of relegated that over to a secular ideology that beauty is subjective to the individual. And he said one of the problems with that is that if God is really good, true, and beautiful, then we're missing out on some aspect of knowing God by not investigating what beauty is and what it's for.
And again, that's something that we are starting to teach more and more in these areas of classical Christian education, the value of painting, the value of music. And sometimes that is something that gets left out. Even in one of my books on art, culture, and media, we talk about that because there isn't sort of a category there. Now, if you're a musician, as you are, well, then we can play in the symphony, or we can play in the choir, and that works just fine. But what about a painter? What about a sculptor? What about a variety of other individuals? They say, is there even a home for us in the church? And that's where I think we need to develop that. And so I was just thrilled that you had a chapter on that, and it's something I hope will continue to develop as we talk about cultural apologetics. But just before we run out of time, you have whole sections here on, of course, instructions on how to be human. But also, I love this, no tidy endings and even crash landing, because in some respects, we have to recognize as much as we want, and they lived happily ever after. Doesn't quite always work out that way, does it?
No, it doesn't. And that was one of the things that I wanted to show with the book was that, I've walked through these apologetic arguments, and I tried to show how they relate to the problems that I'm having in church, and to the problems I'm having with myself, my own naivety, my own immaturity in my thinking. And I'm trying to show people that. But then at the same time, I felt like, at the end of the day, you can have these, and I've seen this happen, you can have these apologetic arguments, but you can still walk away from God, or you can still say, I don't believe. There's that factor of life is messy, and it doesn't always wrap up neatly for us. So I didn't want to just write a book where I'm like, here are the arguments, just believe, and everything will be fine. Because our experience tells us differently. That's not how it goes. And so that was one of the main things I wanted to do with No Tidy Endings, was leave it open, but really make a call to consider, in light of these deconversion stories, consider if you are having troubles with the church, if the church has been a painful experience, and you're ready to walk away. First of all, there's a call to really investigate what you believe, but in the sense of not just what are you leaving, what is Christianity, but I'm really calling people to consider an atheist philosophical framework. What does that mean for their lives? What is that view of the world, and what all does that entail? Because I'm not seeing a lot of people talking about what they are leaving Christianity for. I'm seeing a lot of what, I'm leaving Christianity because of, you listed a bunch of them at the beginning of the show, but they're not saying what they're going to, and then now how that looks in their life and how that plays out. So for the No Tidy Endings, I wanted people to, and that was also crash landing as well. I want people to consider, now you're crash landing back into your world. You've been through mine a bit. What are you going to do with this? And, how is it going to affect you, and where are you at? And so just really taking that into consideration.
And again, just well done. I think this book is a good antidote to some of those deconversions. But I'd be remiss, I know when I've had Dr. Sloan on the program, we always at the end talk about why individuals might want to go to Houston Baptist University. Can you give us a couple of reasons? Because one of those good reasons is to have a chance to study and learn from Mary Jo Sharp.
Yeah, that's right. There you go. Thank you, Kerby. And I grade all my own papers. So, we'd love to have you come. And one of the great things about our program is that it does have we have two different tracks. We have a philosophical track, and then we also have a cultural track. Yes. And so you can kind of have the emphasis either way, but also that it is fully online. So you can come to our degree program from anywhere in the world. And you don't have to set foot on campus. Now, you're welcome to come, because we do have guys like William Lane Craig who will come in and teach a week-long, study with you. But at the same time, some people just can't do that. They're just too busy, or they just can't afford to do that. So you can take this course or this degree program from anywhere in the world. And that's one of the things that's fabulous. And we have you've mentioned some of my colleagues, Nancy Piercy, Mike Lacona, and Jerry Walls. We have Phil Talon. We just have a great group of people there, just an incredible group of thinkers and scholars. And so, yes, definitely want to invite anyone to check it out at www.hbu.edu/MAA. Check out our program.
Again, hbu.edu. And you're now in the Portland area. Sometime I'll have to come say hi to you, because I'm always up there speaking at Cannon Beach and a variety of other places as well. But I would encourage especially our listeners in the Pacific Northwest that carry this program. This would be an opportunity for you to schedule Mary Jo to come there. But, of course, anyone across the nation, if you would like to have her come and speak, there are some great resources on her website so that you can contact her and find out a little bit more. And you can even watch some of the videos. You can see kind of the presentations that she would give. And I am just thrilled that God has certainly used you in a very effective way. And as we point out, even at one part in the book, it's good to have a few more women working in this area of apologetics. So I appreciate the fact that you have been such a very significant force in that regard. And I encourage all sorts of individuals to find out more by going to confidentchristianity.com. Of course, they can also go to Houston Baptist University. So, Mary Jo, it's always great to have you on the program, and I look forward to the next opportunity.
Hey, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
We're going to take a break, and then tomorrow will be our weekend edition. So that'll be our roundtable. And if you find yourself saying, wait a minute, you've covered a lot of material in the last couple of hours. Yes, we, of course, had Robert Hutchinson on as we talked about his book, The Dawn of Christianity, and it's a book I certainly would commend to you. And then this book that we've been talking about with Mary Jo Sharp, Why I Still Believe, a Former Atheist Reckoning with the Bad Reputation Christians Give a Good God. It just came out. I think I noticed it was #1 on apologetics at Amazon. So it's another good reason to get a copy of the book. It is published by Zondervan. It's easy to find. It's available in paperback or Kindle. And I think it would be just a great antidote to some of these deconversions taking place. And that's something we've talked about on this program more than a few times. So tomorrow we do get into the issues in the news once again, and that'll be part of our roundtable. But just before I say goodbye, let's thank Andrew and Steve. We'll see you back here tomorrow on Point of View.
There's an old saying that the first casualty in war is truth. Maybe that helps you understand what's happening in America right now. Thankfully, it's not a war with bullets, but there is a war for control. Control of the country and control of your pocketbook. Truth is under fire, but you can help turn the tide by supporting Truth. Join the Truth team at Point of View Radio. Learn how you can make a difference at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Don't let truth become a casualty on your watch. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151.
So what would you do with an extra $500 a month in your budget? Pay off loans, save it, do something fun? Well, it's something you may need to think about if you become a member of MediShare. MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry, and it works. You can save big time on your healthcare costs, and you don't have to pay for things you don't believe in either. Find out more. Call 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40. 855-SHARE-40.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.